Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Southern California Water Dialogue. My name is Connor Everts, and I will be moderating today. I am the co-chair with Dee Zink from the Metropolitan Water District. She will be doing the questions and answers that we'll get to later. We've got a few slides to tell you how this works, but I'd like to first acknowledge our steering committee who's listed there. We all work to get you the next month's program, and we're always open for new suggestions for subjects as well. I also want to thank, before I go through these rules, our technical committee that works specifically to make this work, our coordinator, Kathy Caldwell, the Met staff, Gary and Joanne that help pull this together, and everyone else that makes it happen. All right, our groundwater rules. If you have technical difficulties and you're still able to get to the chat features on the Zoom, please let us know. To actually ask a question, you're using the Q&A feature. I'm going to type in a question and click and send. The questions will be addressed after the presentation. If you have a poor connection, move closer to your wireless router and turn off other services that are using bandwidth, such as Netflix. Make sure that your attendee audio is automatically muted. This is a webinar through Zoom. We have in the old days when we got together, and I hope we will again sometime before too long, but we would actually have everybody in the room go around and make a very quick introduction. We're not able to do that now, so I'm sorry for that. The presentations are going to run 15 minutes each, and so we want to get started because we have 4 panelists today, big issues on funding, state and federal, and how that's going to work, and the different factors involved. Again, we're just going through the steps here on how to ask a question. And you can also upvote by a thumbs up to move a question to the top of the list. Here's our agenda. As we've just said, concluding, here's all of our speakers. I want to thank all of our speakers today. We've got a great lineup. I'm sure you have a lot of questions, and the point of the dialogue is not just to have presentations, but to also have a real discussion. So we make sure we have time for that. We are recording this, so you know. It will be posted later along with any presentations on the Southern California waterdialogue.org website. And with that, I'm going to ask Abby to take it away and introduce herself. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to address you today. I was asked to speak about federal funding for water infrastructure projects, and I'm grateful for this opportunity. Preparing for the talk allowed me to reflect on what a historic year 2021 was for water infrastructure funding. The endless grind of the pandemic makes it easy to forget the silver linings. And in this case, the silver lining is that Congress recognized how important water is for public health and provided unprecedented amounts of funding for water infrastructure projects. Next slide, please. I'm going to begin by taking you back to March 11th, 2021, and the signing of the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA. This legislation, signed in the first few months of the Biden administration, provided $1.9 trillion to help recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. Included in this bill was the creation of the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. This $350 billion fund administered by the Department of Treasury for state, local, and tribal governments is historic. Never before, and perhaps never again, will the federal government provide such a large sum of money to local governments to stimulate the economy. Next slide, please. The formula for distribution of the funds was set up so that the largest states received the most funding. For once, California came out on top. we receive more funding than any other state in the nation. The state of California received $27 billion, and I'm pretty sure our next speaker is going to discuss this one in more detail. Counties in California, approximately $7.7 billion. Metropolitan cities, another $7 billion, and other units of local government, another $1.2 billion. While the state has already received all of its funding, counties and other units of local government have only received half of their funding. They will receive the final round of funding this spring. The Fiscal Recovery Fund is designed to both help with recovery from the pandemic and stimulate the economy. These funds can be used for 4 purposes, one of which is to make necessary investments in water and sewer infrastructure. The inclusion of water infrastructure was a reflection of how important these resources are in the pandemic. No other types of infrastructure projects except broadband were eligible to use these funds. And let me tell you, lots of other sectors tried to angle in and obtain this funding. Next slide, please. For water and sewer projects, Treasury interpreted the phrase necessary investments to mean projects that would be eligible for EPA's Drinking Water or Clean Water State Revolving Fund, plus a host of other activities, including lead service line replacement, climate change adaptation, dam and reservoir rehabilitation if the primary purpose of a dam or reservoir is for drinking water supply. And all of these funds must be obligated by December 31st, 2024, and construction must be completed by December 31st, 2026. Next slide, please. As you all know, Congress continued to fund infrastructure projects in 2021. After months of negotiation, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, was signed into law on November 15th. This bill, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or bill, funds all traditional types of infrastructure projects, including, again, water projects. The bill is often reported in the news as a $1.2 trillion bill, but that represents both authorizations and appropriations. Authorizations are just permission slips to go seek funding in future appropriations bill. Appropriations are real federal dollars. The IIJA includes $550 billion in direct appropriations over the next 5 years. Like ARPA, this is a historic investment that dwarfs previous infrastructure bills. Next slide, please. You may have heard reports that there is $55 billion in IIJA funding for water, but in my opinion, that's an undercount as it primarily represents funding to the Environmental Protection Agency. I take a more expansive view of federal water funding and include the Army Corps projects, Bureau of Reclamation projects, and EPA programs in my definition of federal water programs. IIJA provides $17 billion to the Army Corps of Engineers. Among other things, the Corps funds navigation and flood control projects. As a water person, I would be remiss not to mention the Corps, as the agency plays a critical role in several projects in Southern California, including restoration of the LA River. I'm not going to take a deep dive into the Corps funding because it's very prescriptive. Your project is either already on the list and authorized to receive funding, or it is not, and you are trying to get your project authorized by Congress as part of the next authorization bill known as WRDA 2022. One item I did want to highlight for you, though, is that the IIJA funded for the first time a new Army Corps low interest loan program, similar to EPA's WIFIA program. This funding mechanism will start off focused entirely on dam repair projects. If you are in need of funding for dam repair projects, this new funding mechanism is something you should tune into. The Bureau of Reclamation helps finance water infrastructure projects in the 17 Western states. IIJA provides this agency with direct appropriations of $8.3 billion over 5 years, or $1.66 billion per year. This is nearly double its yearly budget, and this additional funding will be primarily awarded as grants. I will take a deeper dive into this funding shortly. Last, but certainly not least, the IIJA provides approximately $50 billion in funding to EPA's water programs. About 48 billion of this is going out directly to the states through the SRF program over the next 5 years. For once, the state's SRF programs will be flush with cash, and I will discuss this in more detail in the coming slides too. Change slides, please. This slide gives you a more in-depth view of Reclamation's IIJA funding over the next 5 years. As you can see, the bill provides large amounts of money for various reclamation programs. The additional funding touches on every aspect of Reclamation's mission, including storage projects, water recycling projects, and ecosystem restoration work. Many of these programs are important to Metropolitan. We were actively involved in helping to secure additional funding for the water recycling projects and creating the new large-scale water recycling program. We greatly appreciate the work of our congressional delegation to help make this happen. Next slide, please. January 14th marked 60 days since enactment of the IIJA. And as directed by law, Reclamation released its plan for how the agency will invest its additional $1.66 billion in 2022. The IIJA provided program-specific total 5-year appropriations for Reclamation, but gave Reclamation the freedom to decide specific per-year allocations as long as total spending over 5 years meets the specified amount. For example, if you recall from the last slide, Reclamation received $550 million over 5 years for the Title 16 water recycling program. You can see from the 2022 spend plan that Reclamation has decided to front-load its spending on this program and plans to invest $245 million this year. This is a historic investment as the program only receives $60 million per year through the normal appropriations process. Another highlight of the spend plan is that Reclamation is using IIJA funds to fulfill its obligations to the recently signed 500+ agreement with the lower basin states to create and conserve additional water in Lake Mead. At this time, there is no funding allocated for the new large-scale water recycling program. In fact, there is no funding allocated to any new reclamation program created in the IIJA. However, Reclamation left $280 million in reserves for 2022, and we are working with Reclamation to allow some of this funding to be used for the large-scale recycled water program. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, EPA funding for water programs is primarily provided through the state revolving fund. The Drinking Water and Clean Water SRF receive direct appropriations above and beyond their usual yearly appropriations. Additionally, 2 new funds were created. The Lead Service Line Replacement Fund will be distributed using the Drinking Water SRF, and the Emerging Contaminant Funds will be distributed through both the Drinking Water SRF and the Clean Water SRF. 49% of the Drinking Water SRF, Clean Water SRF, and Lead Service Line Replacement Funds must be awarded as grants or full principal forgiveness loans. All of the emerging contaminant money must be awarded as grants or principal forgiveness loans. Next slide, please. In December, EPA released preliminary allotment of funds to the states. Once again, California comes out on top. The state is set to receive $609.4 million for the SRF program this year, more money than any other state. This is in addition to the yearly SRF appropriations the state receives, and also the lowest amount of IIJA SRF funding that will be flowing to the state over the next 5 years. The IIJA phased in increases to the Drinking Water and Clean Water SRF, starting with $1.9 billion nationally for each fund and escalating to $2.6 billion for each fund in 2025 and 2026. EPA is currently developing implementation documents to guide states in the administration of these funds. Once the documents are completed, the SRF funds will be released to the states. It is anticipated the state will receive its SRF funding in what they sometimes call late winter and other times early spring. Whatever you want to call it, it's coming to the state pretty soon. Next slide, please. As if all of this was not enough, there are still more vehicles out there to provide additional federal funding for water infrastructure. There is, of course, the traditional appropriations route. Federal fiscal years run from October 1st to September 30th, and we are well into the FY 2022 year. The federal government is currently running on what is known as a continuing resolution, keeping government funded at FY 21 levels until February 18th. If a deal can be reached, there's more funding on the table for existing federal programs. The President, House, and Senate have all proposed increasing water infrastructure funding in FY 2022. The Build Back Better Act is in the news a lot lately too. The House passed bill includes additional funding for water programs at EPA and the Bureau of Reclamation. The Build Back Better Act also includes tax parity for water conservation measures. Rebates offered by water agencies for turf removal, low-flow toilets, etc., are considered taxable income. Water agencies must provide 1099s at the end of the year to customers that receive $600 or more in water rebates. Fixing this and making these investments tax-free has long been a Metropolitan priority. With that, I conclude my presentation, and I'm happy to answer questions at the appropriate time. And I will now turn the program over to Rachel Ehlers for the next portion of our conversation.
Great, thanks, Abby, and good afternoon, everybody. Really happy to be here. My name is Rachel Ehlers. I work for the California Legislature, specifically the Legislative Analyst's Office. We are the nonpartisan advisors to the state legislature. So I work for the Republicans and the Democrats. I work for the Senate and the Assembly. My office helps advise on the state budget, as well as policy issues. We put out various policy reports, typically in the summer and fall, but right now we're deep in budget land. So I am here to talk about all of the money, on top of what Abby just talked about, all of the state money for water that is flowing through the state right now. So next slide, please. So here's what I plan to talk about. I'm going to give just a very brief highlight of what the state budget process is, because I can't resist. Talk a little bit about the current state fiscal context. I'll talk about the 21-22 budget that we are kind of in the middle of right now, the middle of that fiscal year, as well as the upcoming fiscal budget proposal, what happens with all that money next, and then finally close out with highlighting some resources for you. Next slide, please. So starting with just 30 seconds of Budget 101, because again, I can't resist. This may be elementary for some of you and maybe new for others, but I think it's really important information for everyone to know, both so you have a sense of when to expect to see funds flowing from the state to the local level, but also when you can engage and when you can get involved. So the blue boxes here are steps that kind of happen on the governor's side of things, the administration, and then the yellow is on the legislative side that I work for. The green is where they have to agree. So on January 10th every year, the governor introduces his budget proposal for the forthcoming fiscal year. So just less than 2 weeks ago was the proposal for the 2022-23 fiscal year that will start on July 1st. My bosses will spend the next few months hearing about those proposals, thinking about those proposals, thinking about whether they like them or not, or what they might want to do differently. In May, the governor will release what's called the May revision, because then we'll have our tax receipts coming in after April and know what kind of resources we really have available for the forthcoming year. So we'll revise the budget proposal. In June, the legislature will put together its own package, work and negotiate with the governor until they can finally come to agreement for a budget that hopefully will be signed by the beginning of the fiscal year in July. And then over the course of the summer and early fall, to the degree funds come in way more than we thought or way less than we thought, or there are other emerging issues that need addressing, there may be some revisions to that as well. So that's kind of what we're busy with up in Sacramento right now. But again, I think important context for you all to know about in case you want to get engaged in this process. Now is the time. Next slide, please. So just some fiscal context. Who would have thought that in the middle of a raging pandemic, we would have unprecedented levels of revenues available at the state level to spend. We are in a very, very strong fiscal position. The budget that was passed last summer by the legislature contained a $47 billion surplus. And what we mean by surplus is funding above and beyond all of the existing commitments that the budget already had in place from the previous year. Looking ahead at the new proposal for the forthcoming fiscal year that the governor just released, it contained an additional $29 billion surplus beyond that was accounted for in the last budget. So of course, we don't know how much of this funding will kind of sustain in future years, but really a lot of money rolling into the state right now. Next slide, please. So what did we do with that money? This is just a pie chart that shows you of that $47 billion surplus that the legislature appropriated in the last budget. You can see most of it was for one-time or temporary spending. And that was, again, because we don't know how long these trends will continue. We don't want to build up new ongoing programs that then will have to come in and be cut in future years. So you can see the purple slice, there was some ongoing spending. The light blue is something that we're always really happy to see money put in reserves for cases when there is a fiscal downturn. But most of it for one-time and temporary spending, including a lot of spending on water, which we'll talk about in a minute. Next slide, please. This is just another representation of how that money was spent. This is not just the surplus, but all of the ongoing general fund in the state budget, close to $200 billion of general fund, which is kind of our basic operating resources for the state government, tax proceeds. So biggest category is always schools and community colleges. Constitutionally, that has to be at least 40% of our state budget. But you can see the second largest category there is resources and environment, which is, again, unprecedented. That is not usually a large source of general fund spending at all. Usually we use bonds to the degree we are prioritizing spending for resources in the environment. So really exciting. You can see it's almost all one-time or temporary, not ongoing. But really large investments, really big priority for the state legislature and the governor in this most recent budget. Next slide, please. So here's what some of that money went for. This was a very large budget package in the most recent budget that just passed. $4.6 billion for water and drought resilience, spread across 3 years, but you can see the bulk of it in this current fiscal year that we are in the middle of right now. This is almost all from the general fund, and I can't emphasize enough how significant that is for state spending from the budget. These are activities that the state has invested in before, but largely from general obligation bonds that voters have approved. And the big difference between bonds and general fund is, number one, we don't have to pay interest on general fund. So it really is a much better deal for the state, frees up that money that we would have spent on interest to spend on something else. And the other is that there's just a lot more flexibility because we can use it for kind of whatever we want. With bonds, it's much more constrained, typically for capital projects, with a lot of rules and requirements around it. But here we have flexibility to really focus on what the state priorities are. So you can see quite a bit of money for drinking water and wastewater. Again, this is state money. This is separate from the SRF funding that Abby just spoke about. Quite a bit of funding for water supply and reliability type efforts. I'll talk about those in a minute. Ecosystem restoration, groundwater management, some funding for immediate drought response. Last summer, as you recall, was pretty intense drought conditions. Hopefully that won't be the case this year, although we need to get some more rain falling. But those immediate drought response were activities like bringing emergency drinking water to communities that were losing it, or conducting fish rescues and hatchery operations for fish and wildlife, some funding for flood management, and then water quality as well. Next slide, please. So I showed this big slide for two reasons. The first is just to give you a sense of the number of different activities that are in that $4.6 billion package. Very large breadth of activities. The second is because no PowerPoint presentation is complete without one slide that you can't read. So now we've checked that box. This is a table that is on our website. I'll show you at the end where you can find it. And I'll talk about some of these categories in a minute that are in a more legible way. But again, just to give you a sense that in that 4.6 billion, there are a lot of very specific categories of appropriation. Next slide, please. So again, this is a subset of that 4.6 billion, just a little bit more of a breakout of what did we mean, what did I mean by water supply and reliability categories. So there's that 1.3 billion for drinking water and wastewater projects. I should also note that even though this funding was appropriated in one year, it will be spread across multiple years, likely in terms of how it is spent. There were several years available to the administering departments for spending the money and allocating the grants. Most of this money will be for grants. Some of it the state departments can use for projects, but most of this money will go out as competitive grants. So the urban and multi-benefit water projects, that 300 million is being administered by DWR. They are already accepting applications. They've already awarded grants for some of those projects. They're really trying to get that water out the door quickly. These are for infrastructure upgrades. SGMA, Sustainable Groundwater Management Act implementation. These are grants to implement some of the groundwater sustainability plan activities. Groundwater cleanup and recycling and water recycling. These are grants through programs that the State Water Resources Control Board administers. The water conveyance repairs, those are not grants. Those are activities that the Department of Water Resources is granting directly for repairs on 4 specific canals: the California Aqueduct, the Frank Kern Canal, the Delta Mendota Canal, and the San Luis Canal. The total repairs for those 4 projects, because of land subsidence and groundwater pumping, is estimated at $2.4 billion. So obviously this $200 million isn't a huge contribution to that, but it's enough to start getting things started, and there will be other funding contributions, particularly for the federally owned canals. And then finally, $50 million for the San Diego Pure Water Project, a specific appropriation for that project. Next slide, please. Here's another subset of that overall amount broken out here for water quality and ecosystem funding, just to give you a sense of what some of those specific activities are. Water resilience projects. This is a new grant program that's going to be administered by the California Natural Resources Agency, specifically for projects in the Delta, San Joaquin River and Sacramento River and tributaries, really trying to improve habitat conditions in a way that hopefully will help improve conditions for fish and wildlife, so that it's not just water flow that they need, but also other activities that are helping improve the resilience of the habitat conditions in the Delta and its tributaries. Stream flow for the environment, a new program that the Water Conservation Board is going to be administering. Additional funding for resilience for fish and wildlife, more funding for the Salton Sea, more funding for the LA River restoration, funding for the Water Board to administer a new program addressing PFAS contamination, and then funding for Border Rivers water quality. So again, just giving you a sample of the breadth of activities for which funding was provided. Next slide, please. So in addition to that $4.6 billion water package, there are some other areas of funding in this current budget that was passed by the legislature last summer that I wanted to raise for you. There was a separate budget package related to climate resilience that included funding for activities to address extreme heat and sea level rise and some other activities. But some of it did have overlap with water here. You can see almost 800 million for quote unquote multi-benefit and nature-based solutions. That's still a little TBD what that funding is going to go for, where that's part of the ongoing budget negotiations right now to specify, even though that money has been provided, exactly what it should go for is still being worked out. 500 million for coastal protection and adaptation projects. That's going to be administered by the State Coastal Conservancy, primarily through grants. And then about 400 million for the Wildlife Conservation Board for fish and wildlife projects. In addition to all this general fund, we've still got bond funding from previously authorized bonds. So this most recent budget included $572 million from Prop 1 and $240 million from Proposition 68 to continue the ongoing programs and grants that those bonds were funding. Another round of funding for the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund from SB 200, which passed a few years ago and provides that ongoing stream to address drinking water issues. And then some funding also for the Department of Fish and Wildlife, both one-time and ongoing, to address some of their priorities, including the California Endangered Species Act implementation, which they have not had sufficient funding to really address their responsibilities and have gotten a boost there. Next slide, please. So all of that, again, is from the 21-22 Budget Act that was passed July, amended September. We're in the middle of that year. That funding is starting to go. But now here came January 10th, and we are again in the budget process with the governor having released his proposal. And here are some new proposals that are on the table for the forthcoming fiscal year. Really, it's not as much as last year, but there's a big chunk here for drought response activities, or what are characterized as drought response. I think some of these seem like a little bit addressing future droughts, not necessarily current drought, and includes this $250 million that's sort of a placeholder to wait and see how the hydrology develops over the spring. So these are proposals that the legislature is in the process of kind of considering now for the forthcoming budget year. Next slide, please. This is just touching on the federal funding, the SRF, State Revolving Fund funding that Abby mentioned. These are 5-year numbers, but those 4 specific programs, the Drinking Water Fund, the Clean Water Fund, and then these 2 new categories for emerging contaminants and lead service line replacements. And as Abby mentioned, the first tranche of funding will come to the state. We heard from the Water Board maybe this fall, but maybe earlier, maybe late winter, we'll see. And that won't flow through the state budget process because it kind of goes straight to the Water Board. They have what's called continuous appropriation authority to get those funds out the door. So when they get them and are ready to go, those will be online this year. Next slide, please. So next steps, all of this funding is in the process of being administered and allocated by state departments. So you should be seeing opportunities to apply for grants already. For some of the newer programs, they're still developing the grant guidelines and application processes. For some of the existing programs that just got a new tranche of money, those should already be starting to be available. The legislature is not only busy thinking about the next budget, but also really emphasizing oversight over that funding and the big funding that was already approved. But how is it getting used? How quickly is it getting out the door? Are there barriers to implementation that the legislature needs to get involved in? Is there really high demand for some programs, in which case maybe some additional funding might be helpful sooner rather than later? So I think that we'll be spending the next several months and year or so overseeing how that funding is being allocated. And certainly if there is feedback you have on certain programs and how they're going, that is something I think the legislature would be interested in hearing as well. Next slide, please. So finally, just some resources for you. And again, these slides will be up on the Dialogues website, but here's a link to my office's website, lao.ca.gov. There you can sign up for an email subscription list just for resources and natural resources and environmental protection related publications we put out. We are analyzing the budget right now, and we'll have some things to say about that drought package, hearing handouts, that sort of thing. You can get emails when we publish things. Here are a couple lists of where you can find some of the resources I've talked about today. The Department of Finance website, that's the governor's department that puts out the budget. So anything you want to see about the budget proposal, that's where you find it. And then I'll just add this last reference here to the California Budget and Policy Center. They've got this great report that really walks through very slowly what the state budget process is, how it works, and how you can get involved. So just provide that as a resource if you want to know more about the state budget process. Final slide, please. And with that, I am happy to pass it on to Jose Solorio, who will talk about his work at the California Water Commission. Looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction. My name is Jose Solorio. I'm here to talk about lessons learned on the water storage investment program. This presentation is by me. They're largely my opinions and reflections. Sorry about that. Couldn't find the video button, but thank you, staff, for alerting me. So I have a presentation here about lessons learned on the WSIP program, the Water Storage Investment Program, Proposition 1. Let's go to the next slide. With lessons learned, you got to think, where do you start, and where are we connected to this issue? This image is a fun image. It's entitled Manta de Agua. It's a cloak that was researched, and it was a symbol of water on cloaks used by Mayan religious and community leaders. So there's always been a fascination with water and how it's connected with life. And so that is something I want to share with you, because at least here where we're at in the Southwest, a lot of our roots are indigenous, and water history goes way back, a lot of lessons. Next slide. Here in California, after those years, we started to see settlements, and we started to see historical records that include things such as average annual precipitation. And I saw this a few years ago, and I always remember it because I know in California we tend to freak out if we have a drought that lasts 2 to 4 years or 6 years. Well, guess what? We've had droughts as long as 100 years that have been recorded here in California. And as mentioned here, it's by looking at tree rings, and this was included in a Stanford research paper some time ago, and so I wanted to share that. Next slide. Then we've had a lot of great thinkers over the years. Benjamin Franklin has quotes on water, many do. This is one of my favorites. When the well's dry, we know the worth of water. We need water, we need to capture it, store it, etc. And I wanted to share that just as a fun point in time. The next one, next slide. Here, some of you know me, most of you don't. Wanted to have you all have a better understanding of where I'm coming from on a lot of the issues that I've worked on in the past, the ones that I'm working on now, and thoughts and ideas for the future. I was raised and I worked myself in the Lost Hills, Wasco, and Mettler area, starting at age 13. That's me in a John Deere tractor with my uncle and younger brother. One photo there in the middle, that's, I guess we're kind of enjoying for a photo op there, me and 3 of my siblings, cotton harvest, because I did a lot of irrigation and, hoeing of weeds amongst the cotton starting at age 13. And then the photo there in the far right, that's me and my younger brother. So my first job was in water, literally in irrigation and farm work. I was a member of the Regional Water Quality Control Board before I was elected to the Santa Ana City Council. There's a virtue of that because Santa Ana has a direct slot on the Orange County Water District Board of Directors. I was on their board a couple of years, was sent by my constituents to the state assembly. I did a decent amount of water work, and I highlighted the 3 things that were top of mind most for me. Number 1, I authored the law legalizing rainwater capture. But believe it or not, we've been doing that for a long time without having a law in place. And so I did that. I was a member of the Joint Conference Committee on Water. I highlight that just because that was actually the committee that worked on the bond, including this WSIP program. So I know it quite well. I know how we all fought for it. I also chaired an Assembly Select Committee on water, in particular as it related to regional approaches to addressing the state's water crisis. After the legislature, I was a legislative advocate for Nossaman, and I represented a lot of public water districts, as well as some members of the California Water Association, which are independently operated, independently run, with oversight by the CPUC, as you know. After that, one of my clients, Molten Water District, they liked what I was doing, and they hired me they hired me full time. So I am their government affairs officer. I got elected back to the San Jose City Council and served on the Met board for about a couple of years, and earlier, and then about last year, more around this time, I was appointed by the governor to serve on the California Water Commission. So that's my background. Not sure if I'm water buffalo status yet, but I started young, and have done quite a bit over the years, and I've learned from many of you as part of this process. So I thank you for that education. Let's go to the next slide. In the legislature, and even up until now, I like to talk about the 3 C's: capture, conveyance, and conservation. We need to do all of them. It's part of the all of the above strategy, and I'm a big believer. And obviously, when we're talking about the WISP program and storage, it's about capturing the water that does fall. Next slide. So now getting a little bit more directly into WISP related things, and again, more on lessons learned. Maybe in the future, I actually would encourage you, if you haven't, a presentation more formally in all the projects, because they're all substantial and amazing. This here is something that was put together by the commission in 2021 that talked about what a milestone year that was going to be for the WISP projects and the deadlines that we had coming up, and made mention of the process. Next slide. The 7 projects, because there were 8 applicants, but 7 ended up going through the process where we're at, and all 7 projects were approved by the statutory deadline. One of the things I want to really highlight is the proposition had a very rigid process that we needed to follow, as well as very set deadlines, including this eligibility deadline. And so really, we've been, doing the work and working very closely with our partners to get them to this key milestone. Next slide. So here on some high level, lessons learned, because that's what, I was asked to really focus in on. So kind of building up to these 2 slides here. I think what I've learned, and again, kind of from afar and now in reflection on all this, I think it's important to set stronger expectations early on about what the process is and the timeline, because I would say that if you really look at the entirety of what was in the proposition, the process, the guidelines, and where we're at now, that we're exactly where we need to be, and in a very diligent way. So I'm proud about that. But I would encourage, because people have different expectations, that it's important to provide, starting with your agency website, a clear process and updates on a regular basis. I think the commission has made efforts to do that. I do have a communications background also, so I've been working with them to do more along those lines, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Partnering with grant applicants to better inform stakeholders about the process and progress. That's important, just because you all know, many of you are in government. Government isn't always the best at marketing things. And so we have these outstanding applicants, and going back, but also going forward, their help and your support in getting the word about the progress, I think is important. Social media obviously is there, and that's a good way to let folks know what we're doing. For example, the California Water Commission, we are on Twitter. I would encourage you to follow us on Twitter if you already aren't. And so, I've been working with staff on the recent actions to make sure that we not just post our agendas, but also the outcomes. And so that's been positive. And then, we need to, I think, keep developing better relationships with the water journalists and key media outlets to get the word out and develop content ideas for them, and photos and graphs and different things, because they're hungry for information. Next slide. History repeats itself. We know that, and so we know that there'll be future programs in the future where they'll say, hey, why weren't you all, working faster, kind of thing. But here in California, we know quite well, especially you, that large public works projects can take years, sometimes decades, to get approved, permitted, funded, and constructed. Definitely, government can always become more efficient, including state government. But oftentimes there are projects like this where really the pace of our work is directly linked with the progress that the project applicants themselves are making. So really, we're at the point because, all these projects, they're getting permits, they're getting their financing, they're getting their board approvals. And so if they can move quicker, we could move quicker. But I think we've kind of just been walking hand in hand and meeting all the timelines. So I would say, we're on time. We can't change past actions. We can only take the best actions now. And so I think we all are at the commission, including staff and commissioners, trying to do better in educating the public on the process, and being a little more quick on some things if we can be. I'll tell you that as a new commissioner, last year we started hearing these projects, and I would be quick to make the motions to move things along if I felt we need to. And I've been really pleased to support all these projects. And then, probably the biggest lesson that I've learned is we have very dedicated, talented, and caring staff and commissioners at the California Water Commission, and we listen. I also mentioned to our executive director that we will get, more, speaking requests, and he himself, Joe Young, who's the executive director, very willing to share his thoughts and expertise as well to this group and others. And to the right, by the way, that's a very nice press release that was done highlighting that all the projects passed the deadline, and excellent information overviews on each of the projects. You could find that also online. Next slide. Which is just to say thank you for your attention and inviting me. You can find more information at that website, or just Google California Water Commission WISP, and you'll get all kinds of information. I'm also very thankful to Governor Jerry Brown and the legislature for their leadership on the water bond. That's a photo of us at the Orange County Water District, where the governor came down to talk to us about Prop 1 and Prop 2. And then finally, I want to thank the governor and his administration and the leadership for their continuing work. And I'm really pleased to be here with all of you. I know there may be questions at the end for me, but we're taking questions after all the presenters. It's now my pleasure to introduce Alessandra Nahera with the Water Foundation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alessandra Nahera, and I'm a program officer with the Water Foundation. I work on our Healthy Communities team, which is currently focused on ensuring all people have access to clean, safe, and affordable drinking water, and also seeks to help communities adapt to a changing climate. Many of you are likely already familiar with my colleague, Alex Paxton, who heads up our Los Angeles program and works regularly with many of the people I see on this call. I am here with you today because my program currently focuses on aligning state and federal programs to ensure funding reaches the communities that need it most. So I handle a little bit more of our federal work, supporting safe drinking water and environmental justice grantees across the nation. On today's call, I'll be focusing a little bit more on California programs while sharing a little bit about the federal programs that are of interest to the philanthropic community and to the nonprofit community. I know that Abby and Rachel have already given fabulous summaries of some of the funding available to our state across the program. So I'll be zooming in a little bit more on a few of these programs that are important to our organization. The philanthropic sector generally is very interested in supporting efforts to ensure funds for drinking water, as we heard, primarily coming through the SRF, successfully reach the communities that need it most. And thus far, a lot of the strategies that have emerged are focused first on technical assistance efforts and community engagement. So this will be exploring innovative techniques to help systems access funds, particularly systems that have struggled to access funds in the past, and ensuring community perspectives are able to influence the types of projects that receive funding and that their voices are included in the process. Next slide, please. So just nationwide, I wanted to give a tiny bit of additional federal policy context on the environmental justice movement that is currently gaining steam at the federal level. The Justice 40 effort is a framework included in a recent executive order issued by President Biden that states that certain federal investments must provide 40% of the overall benefits to disadvantaged communities. The clean water and drinking water SRFs are two of several priority areas that the administration has identified for this investment, which again is 40% of the overall benefits to disadvantaged communities. Now, how these policies will work are still under development, but as we know, these are really important policies because recent analysis by organizations like the Environmental Policy and Innovation Center and University of Michigan recently found that federal funding to help drinking water systems invest in infrastructure generally doesn't reach communities in the greatest need. And there are also significant racial disparities in how this funding is distributed. Now, a number of our community advocates have been saying this for years, but it's wonderful to have analysis and attention to this issue finally after all of their years of work. Finally, the SRF funding is of major interest to the philanthropic community, just given the sheer volume of the funding that we've already heard about, and because of this Justice 40 prioritization opportunity. Next slide, please. The good news is that while there is still plenty of work to be done here in California, I would say, having worked with a number of groups across the nation, California is in relatively good shape due to the hard work that we've all been doing on the SAFER program and the process to identify systems in need. So as you heard recently, there's a huge amount of SRF funding available. We have heard that the total could be nearly $6 billion coming to California through their SRFs in total, which would require potentially nearly $1 billion in state matching funds. So it's hard not to think about the opportunity presented by the budget surplus that we heard about earlier in leveraging this available funding. But the importance of the SAFER program generally is hard to understate, just given the data that we have available through the needs assessment process to be able to identify and track drinking water systems, and the important tool of consolidation as a solution for certain small systems that are struggling with a limited ratepayer base. Next slide, please. One policy that I just wanted to flag that hasn't emerged too much yet in this conversation is a number of different programs at the federal and state level intended to address the issue of low income rate assistance. So low income rate assistance is another kind of tool in our toolbox to ensure the human right to water. As many of you know, nearly all life-sustaining utilities have an affordability program. So we have affordability programs for energy, except for drinking water. So this is a really key topic to dive into as the state has already been working on addressing this issue. And there are a number of state programs and federal programs that are moving forward. So this is important though, as you can see here with the statistics, particularly to Southern California, because UCLA reports that across community water systems in LA, the average household expenditure for like 12 CCF of water per month in LA County saw an increase of 25% over 4 years, which is well above the increase in median household income and inflation. So the cost of water is going up, wages are not going up. And so this is going to represent an increased burden on our communities over time. And finally, just there's a great disparity in how much residents pay for water across systems. So some places are much more expensive than others. So we particularly need to find solutions for renters and for undocumented residents who face restrictions in receiving certain federal funding in order to fulfill the human right to water. And I did want to just flag that it's been great to hear that some systems like DWP and LA have been working on easing the application process or removing the application process entirely for arrearage funding that they have available. So at the federal level, there's a temporary program called the Low Income Household Water Assistance Program, which is housed at HHS, and that funding has been moving to the state through CSD. And that funding has been intended to address some of the COVID arrearages, of which California estimated nearly $1 billion in COVID-related debts for households across the state. Second, there's a permanent pilot program currently at EPA that could be authorized under the Build Back Better bill, which Abby mentioned earlier. So that would be a pilot program, a 40-city pilot at EPA and Build Back Better. But we do hope to continue advocating for a long-term solution that would be a permanent low-income rate assistance program at EPA. The next step will also be creating a permanent low-income rate assistance program that goes beyond just arrearages or debts. The pilot LIRA program at EPA, as I mentioned, is in Build Back Better, and then at the state level, Senator Dodd last year carried a bill that was SB 222, which would provide a framework for a low income rate assistance program that would strengthen the state's ability to receive that federal funding and kind of structure a program. That legislation is still in process, and the legislature and the administration remain committed to continuing to dealing with that issue. So these are all important tools to be able to support our efforts to ensure low-income customers are able to afford their water bills without risking disconnection and jeopardizing the human right to water. And I just wanted to flag that I know that organizations such as the East Yards, CBE, the Communities for a Better Environment, and the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy have been partnering with some utilities in Southeast LA to help them apply to the state's rearage program at the State Water Board. So I just want to continue to encourage everybody to see if there's partnership opportunities with CBOs and helping community members access the available funds. Next slide, please. So just looking forward, some of the key solutions we have here are clearly there are future policy opportunities at the state legislature. We have Senator Dodd's bill. At the federal level, there is the LIRA pilot program that could be housed at EPA and the Build Back Better bill, which is currently stalled in Congress. But it is very important to support historically excluded communities to ensure that funding goes to where it's most needed, and then continuing the hard work already underway to secure these programs. Second, there are just plenty of opportunities and solutions for partnership to ensure community participation. We've heard some really creative ideas about how larger water systems could partner with smaller water systems in the Southern California area to provide technical assistance and other support. And I encourage all of you to continue exploring these opportunities, and the Water Foundation would be happy to just help broker conversations around how this could potentially work. And then when working with historically excluded communities, it is vital to ensure community participation and feedback. So some easy first steps would be translation services and ensuring that meetings are held after work hours so that community members are able to participate. It could reflect partnering with community-based organizations to host listening sessions and ensure that the feedback from those listening sessions is incorporated into program design. This can seem difficult given the relatively short timelines that this federal and state aid needs to be distributed, but sometimes it's important to go slow to go fast in order to achieve durable and lasting solutions. So with that, I look forward to questions in the Q&A, and I will turn things over to Dee for next steps.
Thank you, Alessandra, and thank you to all of our panelists today. I'd like to ask the panelists to each of you turn your cameras on so that we can go ahead and start our dialogue discussion. Just a reminder, I know Connor went through this earlier, but if you have a question, we're asking that you type your question into the Q&A, not into the chat. And I will walk through the questions, maybe add in a couple of others. But also, if you would like to, if you have a question that you think is a great question and you want to make sure it gets up to the top, I see only 4 questions right now, but as we go, I always find that the questions start piling in. So if you see one you really want to make sure we answer, particularly as we get close to the 1:30 hour, which is when we typically end, please upvote them. So why don't we go ahead and get started. We're going to start off with a question from Charming Evelyn from the Sierra Club. And I'm going to address this question to you, Rachel. Charming's talking about the fact that drought has been mentioned, and why isn't firefighting mentioned as well? And is this an issue that should be included in terms of funding from the budget?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yes, yet another one of the significant budget packages included in those totals, that kind of natural resources line was $1 billion for forest health and forest kind of fire prevention, some of it, but also general forest health and intended to help reduce severe wildfires. So I don't know if the question was about fire response. There were billions of dollars provided for fire response last year, because that's just kind of when the fires come and we need more Cal firefighters out there. We put money in it, whether we've budgeted for it or not. But I think there's a big emphasis, huge increase over the past 2 years, I would say, within the state legislature about let's try and prevent these fires before they come. So it's both thinning prescribed fire in the forest to reduce fuel loads, but also fuel breaks around communities so that when there is a fire, it won't enter the community. So yes, I would say that is a huge emphasis and discussion in Sacramento. I just didn't focus on it too much because the water nexus is a little bit more tenuous, but I think there's also increasing discussion about the effect on watersheds of what happens in our source watersheds when there are severe wildfires, and how does that affect the ability of the ground to soak in and absorb the snowpack, but also run off into our reservoirs that decreases capacity. So yes, huge area of emphasis.
Thank you, Rachel. And Abby, I don't know if you want to comment. There's been some federal funding and federal programming to try to assist in this effort, but I know you weren't prepared to talk about that today.
Yeah, I agree.
Abby.
There is pretty much exactly what Rachel's talking about at the federal level in the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act. And I was just looking through my charts, and I don't have it handy right now, but I know for the first time the feds had been something they've been talking about for a long time, and it's also in there. I just didn't focus on it for this talk.
Great, thank you, Abby. Okay, let's go to the next question from Diane Wallace. And by the way, Diane put in the chat that she loves our panel today. So kudos to all of you. And thank you, Diane, for the compliment. Her question is, will the state aqueduct solar project study be looking at the entire aqueduct? And will it also address the security of the aqueduct? Rachel, I don't know if you're familiar with the study and can answer this question, but if you could give it a shot, we'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I think it was $20 million that was provided for this pilot project to see about the feasibility of putting solar panels kind of over the aqueduct to both kind of protect the water from evaporation, but provide shade, but also generate electricity. So it's not for the whole aqueduct. It's just a pilot project to kind of see how it works, proof of concept before we invest more funding in it. There was no funding provided specifically for security over the aqueduct. And then the other piece that I did mention is the funding for some repairs for subsidence.
Thank you, Rachel. And if I didn't mention this earlier to our panelists, if you have something you want to add to a question, just please unmute your mic and join in. I'm going to direct this next question to Alessandra. Lynn Planbeck is asking about the funding for Lifeline water rates for public agencies. And she's been trying to work on this issue. She represents a water district that is a wholesale water provider, I believe. And Lynn, you can chat more if you need to, but running into challenges on Lifeline rates because of Prop 26. We know that Prop 218 at the city level has been a challenge as well. So could you speak a little bit about that, Alessandra?
Sure. So the programs that currently exist are kind of more focused on the COVID debt arrearages, but I still encourage you to encourage your staff to look into the State Water Board's arrearage program, a link to which I can put in the chat. And then the CSD also is administering the low income household water assistance program that I mentioned. So those are the main funds that are available at this current moment. And then hopefully, as I mentioned, the DOD bill will continue to move forward. And there is the pilot low income rate assistance program in the Build Back Better bill. And those are more permanent long-term programs that go beyond COVID debt response. And I also think that there might be a few other folks on this call who might have additional answers from the perspective of a wholesaler.
And Abby, I saw you nodding your head. Did you have anything to add to what Alessandra said about federal funding for this type of program?
She sort of nailed it. There's a lot. We're also waiting when it comes to conveyance and the solar projects. It's all sitting out there in the Build Back Better Act. So we're sort of waiting to see where we go with that.
Okay, and I don't know if you can see that Lynn has added to her question in the chat, but go ahead. I want to call you Director Solorio because for a while, Jose Solorio also served on the Metropolitan Board. So you have many, many titles in front of your name. Jose.
Yes, I just started young, but thank you, Dia. You know what I wanted to share too, the California Water Commission, part of the reason why I'm so excited about being on this commission is they do some very important stuff, but really not in that many different bucket areas, if you will. You know, one clear priority right now is WISUP and delivery of those projects, but we also do a good amount of oversight on the state water project itself, especially kind of on the capital and the maintenance standpoint. So for example, if you were to go to the Water Commission, their November meeting, and I'm going to here in the chat put the link to it. You'll see some really fascinating reports from DWR and the folks that work on the State Water Project on like real projects that they're doing now, whether they be solar related or liners, different things. Also some fascinating studies about how do we really look at climate change from the perspective of how do we start designing things differently now, and measuring and planning for it. And there's a lot of really good work being done by the state and its partners. And so really, if you're interested in the State Water Project and construction and CIPs and stuff, the California Water Commission is another great place to look for that kind of information.
Thank you, Jose. Did anybody else have anything they wanted to add? Okay, then I'm going to move on to Evelyn Wendell's question. She asked where the best funding opportunities are to support water quality and more specific data gathering and communication support. And for those of you who don't know, Evelyn Wendell, she represents an organization called We Tap, and they promote the value of tap water.
I can start with that one, and then maybe Alessandra's got some ideas too. I mean, where I would say in terms of the state agencies is the State Water Resources Control Board. That's the state department that kind of works on water quality. In terms of which funding pots or availability, I think some of it would be the Clean Water SRF State Revolving Fund that has federal funds, probably has some opportunities. As I mentioned, there's this new project around PFAS, contamination, water quality specific there. And then the SAFER program, if it's like a small community contamination issue for drinking water specifically. So those would be my suggestions of the programs to look at, but really starting with the State Water Resources Control Board. They've got a lot of different grant programs.
Yes, and I would agree with Rachel's assessment. I would just add that if there are nonprofits on the call who are interested, there are a number of funders interested in supporting how this federal funding will move through nonprofits. And I would say that, at least in California for right now, feel free to reach out to the Water Foundation. Is probably the best arbiter, at least for what funding is available through the philanthropic sector.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. Our next question comes from Cheryl Fowler, and she's asking about water quality and ecosystem funding, specifically stream flow for the environment. Is the funding focused solely in the Delta, or is there funding available for more broadly than the Delta area? So Rachel, can you pick that up?
No, that program is not Delta specific. So it's being administered by the Wildlife Conservation Board. I think I think of it as a new program, but I think they do have an existing stream flow grant program. And I hear that they are going to administer it through that existing program, so they don't have to go through kind of creating all that bureaucracy of a new program, with some tweaks though, because of how the program is structured. But I think it's really intended to do things like be able to buy a water right for the environment, to keep water in streams and rivers and that sort of thing. So no, that program is not exclusively Delta.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. The next question that we have, actually, it's Charming is responding to earlier, thanking you, Alessandra, for bringing up environmental and social justice. So the question she's raising, and I think maybe Jose, this is to you as well, is where's the focus on tribal consultation and social justice concerns around the projects? And if I'm interpreting this correctly, I think Charming's asking about the storage projects that have been approved through the Water Commission. And I don't know if you can respond to that, Jose.
Yeah, I'm a newer member to the commission, and I'm just now starting to understand and appreciate our relationships with our tribal leaders. I know when we had some tribal leaders, I think at both our November and December meetings, we heard from them, we engaged. I know staff previously and ongoing continue to have dialogue. I think we gotta keep making a priority to have early and and ongoing dialogue with our tribal leaders, process, and what happened before. Again, I can't speak to the past. I can only speak to the fact that it's an issue that's important to me and a constituency that's important to me. And if I can ever be part of a liaison to make sure that the California Water Commission or any other group do its proper due diligence and communications, I will make every effort to do so. I know then, I spoke of, Mexican Americans, our blood, has indigenous blood and Spanish blood. And so this whole area is very important. I thank you for listening on this meeting and look forward to continuing to dialogue. I know maybe it wasn't the precise kind of answer that you were looking for, but again, as a newer member, I just wanted to share those comments.
Thank you, Jose. I want to point out for those of you that aren't watching the chat, there's a lot of good information in the chat, some good comments that have been made, and some resources that Alessandra and others have added to the chat, including websites. I'm going to go back. I don't see any other questions that have been submitted, but please feel free to continue to add questions until we get close to our concluding time. But I wanted to ask, Abby, you started out with your presentation about that this is unusual, that we would have this much attention on water. And we often talk about water being hidden infrastructure. Do you see this as like a water is going to be on equal with large infrastructure, transportation, et cetera? Or what do you think is going on right now?
Well, my dream would be to answer that question. Of course, Congress has realized it's important for life. I mean, it's hard because something like transportation has very regular 2-year bills that always have to go through Congress. And water does in the terms of WRDA, but they can keep that very narrowly focused. Just as Army Corps, there's no regular water bill that has to be more expansive than that, whereas there is for transportation infrastructure and other things. So that makes it more challenging, I think. And I had another thought there that I have just forgotten, but that's sort of the big issue, is we don't have as regular a vehicle, but we certainly have the bad grade for our investment. And then, oh, this was my other thought. It's easier there because there's one agency, right? There's the Department of Transportation. Water, as you get the sense from this call, is diffuse, right? Like, I thought I had covered all the topics, then I'm like, oh, right, there's the forest angle. Oh, there's the tribal angle. Oh, like I deliberately left out the low income angle when we added Alessandra. Like it's so much broader that it makes it harder to say, yes, Congress is going to stay focused. It's sort of so broad, I think people sort of give up or walk away or just get in their niche.
Thanks, Abby. And I'm going to go to Jose, but I was going to go to you anyway. So I'm glad you popped up there. So whatever you're going to say, will you add to it? How do we get the legislature's attention as a former legislator on these huge investments that transcend sometimes their service in the legislature?
Yes. And an excellent point, because for example, again, I was there when we drafted the first water bond. There was a couple of punts because of the economy. You might remember, the Great, Depression and all that. So really, by the time then it actually made the ballot and this implementation period, there's very few folks doing the oversight piece. I'm proud to say that when this new generation of water commissioners were going before Senate approval, there are some legislators from my era, that they're watching us. And so I'm glad to see that the oversight, and one of the benefits to these longer term. So hopefully that'll be helpful. But two things. Number one, on what I wanted to say, of the 7 projects, 2 are in Southern California, and they're of a good size. There's the Willow Spring water banking conjunctive use project. They're eligible from us for the public benefits portion, $393 million. That's real money. Something else too that isn't as common law that I like to promote is we've already done for all these groups about $100 million in early funding that's helping pay for all their work. So for example, that project has already received an early money, $5 million. We also have the Chino Basin Conjunctive Use Environmental Water Storage Exchange project. That one is also 350 million plus, and they've been early funding. They've received $9 million. And again, that's money that they already have. So this idea that, we haven't been putting dollars out or doing good work, a lot of folks just unfortunately don't have the information or understand the process. Back to your point, and we have limited time. I think, Dee, we all need to rally around the big recycling project that Met is working on, and making that a priority, not just for Met, but for everybody, because I think we're all going to benefit from it. And so I know I've talked to our agency leadership, and I'm excited to talk to others about how we can all rally around that and make that project happen, because that's a project too, like these projects, the timeline is similar, and my friendly challenge is, let's see how many WISIP projects we can get built, and let's see when and how we can finance and get built that major recycling project that Met is working on, and that the new general manager is doing a fantastic job of spearheading.
Well, I'm going to take the Q&A privilege and say I agree with the comments just made by our last speaker. We have a couple more questions, and I'm going to make sure we get them all in. First, I'm just going to respond. Cheryl Fowler's asking about our presentations. I think Connor said this earlier, and we will post it at the end, but all of the presentations, including this recording, will be posted at the SoCalWaterDialogue.org website. And we'll flash that up on the screen at some point, and maybe someone on our team can go ahead and type that in as well in the chat. And then I see a question, Rachel, from Carlos Moran. And thank you, Carlos, for moving over from the chat to the Q&A. That helps me quite a bit. So this question about, are the state budget allocations planned for the DWR's IRWM program? And I meant to stop a few of you and ask you to explain some acronyms, and I forgot about that. But maybe you can explain that too, Rachel.
Yeah, so IRWM is Integrated Regional Water Management, and that is a program that has been funded through several different bonds and several different rounds of trying to bring groups together in a region and plan regionally for water projects. In terms of that particular subset of the IRWM program, I'm not sure. It has been funded by Proposition 1. There is still Proposition 1 funding that hasn't been fully allocated, so I'm not sure if if there's another kind of round of that embedded in the Prop 1 money that's still moving. There was not additional new money for that program in Proposition 68 or in the general fund package that just went through. But there may still be some Prop 1 money moving through, and I apologize. I haven't tracked that specific program to see if there are still some additional unappropriated Prop 1 dollars going through there.
Thank you, Rachel. And then we've got another question now by Pierce Swan. And this is to you, Alessandra. He's asking about the consolidation and opposing the most expensive projects, often unneeded, like ocean desalination, are important. These are, I'm reading Pierce's question just in case you guys are wondering why the stilted language. They are important tools to keep water affordable. We should task larger districts with experience in addressing some of the problems in disadvantaged communities with the state reimbursing costs for doing this. Alessandra, I think you alluded to that. You've heard some creative ideas recently about how some larger districts could help smaller districts. Could you illuminate on that a little bit?
Absolutely. So I think it's been important to note that the SAFER program hasn't tried to, promote a one-size-fits-all solution. Consolidation is one tool, but it doesn't work for every single water system. There have been kind of more formalized programs like the administrator program that seeks to do some of this assistance process. But I think there are also ways that are kind of even smaller scale than the administrator program, where larger systems could provide technical assistance to smaller systems, but it will require some creativity, particularly around liability questions. But I absolutely think we should be exploring all of these tools that we have available to us. And I think it will require all of the expertise that the folks on this call has to solve the challenges facing some of these small systems.
Thanks, Alessandra. And then I see we have a follow-up, Rachel, on future funding for the IRWM program. Can you respond to that?
Yeah, it will depend on what's included in future appropriations. As I said, there wasn't money for IRWM in the big general fund package. I don't think there was any in Prop 68 either, but I'd have to double check on that. But so I think whether that will just be a decision for the legislature or the voters if there's another bond that ends up being proposed. But there wasn't funding explicitly for that program in the recent general fund water package.
And just so I can make sure we're being clear, that's neither the package for the 21-22 fiscal year or the proposed package that the governor just released.
Correct.
So you're going to need to contact your legislator to encourage them to weigh in on that, sounds like. Okay, the only other question that I had on my little tablet here, and I'm not seeing more come in yet. Oh, I'm sorry, I am seeing more come in. Charming has a question. Does the budget include extra money for the 7 regional water board? I think it's 9, but the state regional water boards for enforcement.
There was some funding in the last summer's package for drought related enforcement issues and monitoring, but not ongoing baseline increasements for enforcement.
I think the agency funding continues to be a challenge in a few different areas, both at the state and the federal level, in terms of moving forward on programs. So I'm sure there'll be more discussion on that as we go forward. Okay, the other question, Alessandra, you referenced, speaking of acronyms, you referenced the SAFER program, and I don't know that everybody's familiar with that, and I thought it might be good for you to explain that.
Sure, sorry, I had to make sure I could get off mute. So the SAFER program is just kind of the name that they built. That's the Safe and Affordable Funding for Equity and Resilience program at the State Water Board that houses a number of the different drinking water and human rights water programs that the State Water Board has. So it's designed to ensure that Californians have safe, affordable, and clean drinking water.
All right, thank you. And I'm going to call on you, Jose, and then if anybody else has something they'd like to add, and invite Connor back on to help us wrap up today. Please feel free to jump in, but go ahead, Jose, you can start. You're on mute.
Real briefly, just to help fill in time and get good content out. The commission was also asked by the administration to work on groundwater trading and safeguards for that. So there's some good white papers and information on our website about that. The administration also asked us to study what the state's role is in regional conveyance projects, which I really like that because I think it's just kind of a sign of more things to come on hopefully more dollars for regional conveyance projects so we can move water around to where it needs to be. And then finally, we were just recently, like over the past month or so, asked to look at droughts that are 6 years or longer. I believe with the understanding that DWR and many others, State Water Board, they're focused on the current crisis in the here and now, but that it's time, given climate change and everything else, for us to start thinking about how the state and communities throughout California can address droughts that could last 6 years or longer. So wanted to let you know about that work, and there'll be some regional outreach hopefully on that and additional communication on that, because that'll be a very nice opportunity to connect with all of you to get your ideas on how we might do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. Go ahead, Rachel, and thank you. Welcome back, Connor. I'm going to turn my camera off now and let you all speak.
I just want to amend my most recent response. There were some additional new staff positions provided to the State Water Board and the LA Regional Water Board last year for some stormwater related activities, compliance and activities. So for the person who asked about enforcement resources, there were some a few new staff, not huge amounts of money, but something. Should give them credit for that.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank all of our speakers, our panelists, all of you for participating The information will be posted at our website, as was mentioned before, SouthernCaliforniaWaterDialogue.org. And our next meeting, which is always on the fourth Wednesday at noon, is February 23rd. Please let us know if you have any suggestions for future meetings or how we can do these better as we move forward. I guess at this point, after a long dry spell, after huge floods, we will pray for rain as climate change impacts our baselines. Thank you all very much.